Hi, I'm Steve Morgan, founder of Cybersecurity Ventures and editor-in-chief at Cybercrime magazine. I'm here today with Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple. Steve, welcome. Great to have you with us today.
Hey, it's so great to be here, to join my life to talk about things that are important to me.
Steve, before computer hacking, there was phreaking, the PH stands for phone, and the phreaks would reverse engineer the system of tones that telecommunications companies use for long-distance dialing. Recreating the tones for each number at just the right pitch could mean making a free call rather than running up expensive charges. In 1957, Joe Engressia, known as Joy Bubbles, a blind 7-year-old boy with perfect pitch, hears a high-pitched tone on a phone line and begins whistling along to it at a frequency of 2600 hertz, enabling him to communicate with phone lines and become the US's first phone hacker or phone phreak. Steve, I don't know if that's a good starting point. Did you know Joe or of him, and what can you tell us about him?
I didn't know Joe. I knew of him from that Esquire article in October of 1971, I think. No, it must have been before that. But no, it's kind of amazing because whether other people told him, he was close to people that worked in like telephone company switchboards, and he loved to visit them. To even touch the material meant something to him. And so probably somebody told him that you could whistle 2600 hertz. I can't do that high of an E. It's the second harmonic of the high E string on a guitar. But if you whistled it once, you got a one. And after you seized the phone line, you whistle it long. And it seized the phone line. Now, some internal piece of telephone equipment is thinking, I'm going to listen to tones to see where to dial. If you whistle once, it's a one, and two, it's a two. Like tapping the hook switch on a phone, you could actually dial phone calls. So Joe Engressia used that technique where he could just whistle calls. It's very hard to whistle two tones at once, which is what later came about to most of us blue boxers.
So you mentioned the article in Esquire. Before we go there, because I do want to ask you about that, the modern definition of the word hack, if I have it right, was coined at MIT in April of 1955, and the first known mention of computer hacking occurred in a 1963 issue of The Tech, which was also published by MIT. When did you first hear about phreaking or hacking, and what was your earliest activity?
I first learned about phreaking in the Esquire article in 1971 and summer of 71, just before I headed off to a year of college. But I heard about, I think, the word hacking in a later year in a book called Hackers, written by Stephen Levy, who's a famous tech journalist. And it talked about the MIT Model Railroad Club and how they got access to a computer at night for free when you couldn't afford it. I mean, it's like you could go through a year of college and get, in today's dollars, $1 million worth of computer time that just wasn't available to the public. And they'd sit there and write programs on it for the sake of getting better at programming. And that's what they called hacking. And they would hack away and try to make the best version of a program or a routine that they could. And the other hackers around them would often compliment whoever wrote the best version. Somehow it's a combination of simplicity and elegance and speed and performance and everything. Got known for it. But basically, they were trying to find a way to do something better. Not that they were assigned it like a class project. It wasn't like a rule of life. Here's what you do. It's like just wanting to do it and seeing if you could do something a little bit better. It's that internal motivation and push. I don't know how to describe it because not everyone has it. Some of us grow up with this push, and I think most inventors have that kind of a push. See a problem. Maybe this would work as a solution. Run into the laboratory, try it out. But in the end, hacking is also a way to find little better ways. You weren't supposed to be able to do it, but it's like a shortcut. And it's not the evil form that the word took on in later years when every newspaper convinced everybody that the word hacker only meant somebody trying to steal your goods and take over computers.
So, Waz, you mentioned the article in Esquire. It was published in 1971. It was written by Ron Rosenbaum, Secrets of the Little Blue Box. When you first read that article, what was your reaction to it? What kind of impact did that have on you?
It was just grabbing me because it was technical people talking like technical experts and engineers. And in the article, they had this internal goal to just really expose Ma Bell to its flaws and help Ma Bell get better. And they didn't want to say they were just doing it to steal money. And they'd be kind of cautious, like they were being tapped when they talked in the article. It was so intriguing. And it said, The Secrets of the Little Blue Box, an interesting story. Now, as I read it, this is fiction. To me, it was fiction. There aren't really these great telephone engineers running around and plugging into payphones and setting up their own networks. Are there? And then halfway through the article, I called Steve Jobs, who was my technical friend. And I started reading the article to him. Strange, the people like Joe Engressia and Captain Crunch, and they were saying these oddball things. And it was like, this was like stuff you read in a book or a movie, fiction. And then I said to Steve, at one point, I said, the trouble is they're giving away some real tone numbers. Like you said, 2600. To dial a one, it would be a mixture of 900 hertz and 1100 hertz, or 700 and 900. And they didn't give a whole list. They gave a few examples, one, two, and three, maybe. And I started going to Steve, maybe this stuff's real. This article sounds too real. In later times, Ron Rosenbaum got a little pissed at me for thinking it was fiction. And it was totally investigative journalism. It was 100% real, but it triggered us. So Steve and I ran to the one technical library that might have information about the phone company. And oh my gosh, we validated this stuff was real and we were shaking. All you have to do is put tones into a phone. And by that point in time, 1971, individuals could make tone makers. And knowing the formula, passing it on to others, it was kind of a new way of making free phone calls. There were other ways in existence, like getting a hold of somebody's phone credit card or guessing a bunch of numbers, hitting on a good one, and then billing it to some credit card. They couldn't trace it to your number in those days. They couldn't trace a name. Everything was very anonymous on the phone system. You could put tones into a phone that would fool an operator in a payphone. Beep, 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 beep. 5 quick beeps at the right tone, and the operator would think you had put a quarter in when you hadn't. These are amazing times. The black box was just like $2 worth of parts. And a phone call comes in to your dorm room or whatever, press a button and go click, and it answers the call. And if you build the device the right way, you can still hear the person talking, but you're not being billed. The phone company thinks you disconnected.
So, Waz, there have been so many media stories about the blue box that you developed. And I've seen different accountings and they're not all the same. So I'd really, really love to hear the story directly from you. How did you build this blue box and how many of them did you sell? Is it true that the police shut down your operation? How is Steve Jobs involved? And I did read that he said that had it not been for that experience together with you and the blue box, that Apple may not have been created.
I know where Steve's coming from, and I kind of agree. But back in those days, now you knew that if you could create these tones, we were going from a world that was analog, where tone makers had all sorts of electronic components hooked up in the right way, and they'd make a tone, but if the temperature changed slightly, the tone would change slightly. It was hard to make it stable and accurate. And when Steve and I first discovered this, we ran out down to the local electronics store and bought a little part that we could make a multi-vibrator, a simple little tone generator, but we couldn't really stabilize our tone and measure it and get the right tones. We tried, but that's the nature of analog circuitry. You adjust something, you try it a little different. I went off to college the next day, and in there very soon I had a bunch of computer classes, and I'd go down and use the computer on campus at Berkeley. And I first of all ran a bunch of numbers saying, if we start with a crystal of 1 megahertz, or we start with a crystal of 2 megahertz, or 1.5 or 3-point color TV frequency, which one has the simplest divisions that get close to the tones we need? I had this idea to take digital parts, counters, and put a signal into them from the crystal oscillator, always the same tone, always predictable. And I was going to put that in, divide by the amount. If you pushed a 5 on the phone, it would divide it down right. If you pushed a 1, it would divide one side down to 700 hertz, the 700 hertz tone, the other side down to 900 hertz, play them together. And so I basically made a digital box that was always accurate on tone to what it was. And what a trip that was. I was so proud of my box showing it off, because all these other people had built the old electronics analog ones. This was digital. And I had tricks in there that I never even equaled in my Apple designs, believe it or not. Knowing the internals of chips and being able to take the inputs of a chip and turn them into outputs as well as the inputs. They were both inputs and outputs at the same time. And the output would turn the chip on. How could the chip generate something when it wasn't on? Oh, no, I did amazing things. That was part of my life anyway by then. And I was just proud of this device, and it always worked.
Amazing. Now, did you sell them or were you giving them away?
I was only showing it off. I was a shy person, but this brought me out of the shyness, and I could show it to the other people in my dorm. Look at how this works. Look what it does. And I pass on the folklore of the Esquire article. I collected other articles. I passed them around. One pole vaulter up on the 8th floor got a letter from his parents one day wondering how come they hadn't been charged for 2 of their phone calls. He was using that little $2 black box, which was in Ramparts magazine that year. This was just a fun time in my life. And then one time I was doing a demo in the dorms. I had a way to go around and do demos in a dorm for an illegal product, but not get caught ever. So Steve Jobs was with me, and we'd drive back and forth up to the dorms. And blue boxing was one of our common things, just like Bob Dylan was. And he'd be in the dorm, he'd see all the interest. He'd say, we should sell them. I never thought of it. Sell them. He says, how much does it cost you to make them? And back then, when you're buying parts, single quantity from these distributors that sell to companies, a little $1 chip will be sold for $12. And I told him the cost to build this whole thing, including the case and the keyboard, was $75. And he said, we'll sell it for 150. He instantly came up with some number like that. I thought, you got to be nuts. College kids paying $150 back then, that's like $1,500 nowadays. That was a huge amount of money. And every single demo we did, we made them record it. They kept the recordings of maybe an hour and a half of me showing off all the tricks I could around the world with the phone. And every time we sold one, we sold the blue box for $150. So that was Steve Jobs' idea, was to sell it. He had no money. You know what? I didn't even need to go to college to have a job forever in my life. I was so advanced in engineering and digital that money wasn't the issue for me, but it was kind of nice. And we sold onesie twosies for a while. And then a couple of students came and said they wanted to buy 10 at a time, 20 at a time. And we made some money, and that I feel guilty about now because I was careful. I believe the Esquire article that you're just exploring the system. And if I called my relatives in Orange County, California, I paid the long distance charge on my dorm phone number. I mean, I didn't use the blue box to call them for free, even though I could have. I only used the blue box to experiment and trick operators around the world into thinking I was an operator and knowing some jargon to extend the lines and to get where I wanted to go. That was my thing, but I sold them to other people that were using them just basically to cheat my bill.
Now, what were the students doing with them when they would buy 10 at a time?
I have no idea. Steve Jobs and I put a card in each of the blue boxes, and it said he's got the whole world in his hands. And if it ever came back with that card in it, I promised I'd fix it. So they had a built-in warranty with that card. And one guy, I don't know, the cops probably set him up. He had a burglary in his house. He called the cops. So now that they were in his house, they searched everything, including his car, and they found a briefcase with all of my blue boxes in it. And now every time a celebrity got busted in LA with that little card in their blue box, they went back to Leonard, and I heard about them. It was like the woman that played Mannix's secretary got busted, or Ike or Tina Turner, one of them, they got busted with my blue box. So I was a little bit, proud of that as a young kid. And what they were doing with them, I think it was making themselves a little bit impressive with a business to sell your device that can make you free phone calls. And they did. They sold a lot of them.
Is it true, that the police shut the operation down or no?
It's not true that the police shut down my blue boxing or I ever got in trouble for blue boxing. No. One time I wanted to, you're a young student in college, you've never even had a kiss, and put on a lineman's handset that I owned. And I'd go over to the girls' dorm to show them, here's how you can hook up to a phone line in your first floor of your dorm. And then you can listen in on other rooms, like the house mother. And oh boy, the house mother went by. She was not too happy. She called the police. So they arrested me for that. But it was just basically showing off a lineman's handset that I knew something about phones, 2 girls. And I was in jail and out of jail in 3 hours and pleaded guilty to some little minor thing. But that was not blue boxes. I think there were things that were said to me that I believe they were on to me or close to on to me for the blue boxes. Probably the fact that I never made any free calls without paying.
Right.
Maybe on the school phones. Maybe that's one reason I barely squeaked by. No, I was very lucky.
It's interesting. We've interviewed quite a few people. And I think of, I don't know, just to bring one name up, Kevin Mitnick. I don't know if you know Kevin or.
Very well.
Okay. So Kevin, as far as I'm concerned, there was no malice. He just was extraordinarily curious, probably pushed the envelope too far. But there are people who make up the history of hacking where they were just brilliant. And then at some point, somewhere along the line, hacking changed, or at least for a lot of people it did, because we still use that word now to describe cyber criminals. Back in the day, were you exposed? Did you know of any people who maybe were hacking with malice or phreaking with malice?
For computer hacking, no, I didn't. As a matter of fact, I have never really hacked, like tried to go in and crack an operating system or something like that. The closest I came was a friend of mine was at Beverly Hills High School. and he was a phone freak that I met on a phone network. And they ran their programs on computers there. They had some computers there, not when I was in high school. And it was an HP something Model F computer. And I asked John Draper, my friend John Draper, and he or somebody he knew said, "Oh, you just type in a simple little basic program, 10 dim A of 10, and then run it." And it crashed the computer and they had a backup, and it crashed the backup, and they had a backup and crashed after their last backup. And finally, I guess they called HP and found out, you got to move up your operating system to G. Now, that was a little bit like hacking, but I never hacked myself. I did get other people's passwords 3 times, but it was really for my own interest in pranks. And one was when I had a little terminal designed to get on the ARPANET. Now today's internet has billions of terminals. The ARPANET had 6 computers: MIT, Stanford Research Institute, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, Utah. And oh my gosh, I had to be on this new thing. And I built a terminal digitally that would connect through my modem. I built a modem. I didn't really design the modem from scratch. I copied a data sheet, but everything else I designed from scratch. And I was on the ARPANET. And then there was a local outfit I discovered called Call Computer. You could get a little account and log in with your terminal and call this local time sharing outfit. And John Draper had an account there, Captain Crunch.
Right.
And he was in my apartment and I watched him type his password. He didn't move his hands at all. And with his keys kind of on the home row, he went click, 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 4 keys. And so Steve Jobs and I went down to Call Computer and we went to his name and tried to guess his password. The second password I guessed, WERE, was his password. And we saw he had his resume in there. We were thinking of adding his arrests to it, but we didn't. We didn't go the bad way. We're doing stuff for fun, really. And one time, one of my stepchildren had a website in the house network. His name was Adam and his password was Adam. So after I discovered that, I went up to his mom. I'll play pranks on anybody. And I told his mom, maybe we can crack his password. And I showed her how to try. And she thought she cracked his password. I say, okay, now do this. By the way, I had moved all of his folders way out of sight where you can never find them. His system folders, his control panels and all that. I'd made it so impossible to search around in blank space and never get back. I had his mom create a folder right on the desktop that said, "From Mom." And he was livid. And the only other time was a guy was trying to hack into my system. I ran classes for 8 years and I gave all the students phone-in access so they could get on AOL. It's easy now. It was really hard. This is back before there were laptops even. And they could phone in and get on the internet. I saw a guy one day, he had a server set up called Send Me Porn at killerjupe@AOL.com. And what the heck, Send Me Porn? We have school stuff here. And I searched around. Oh, none of our computers were like that. I said, oh, he might have phoned in on one of my students' accounts and come in. So I went to AOL and his name was killerjupe@AOL.com.
Right.
And I tried password. About the second password I tried was Jupe, Jupe. Oh my gosh, I was in his account and he wasn't one of my students, but he was using one of my students' accounts. So he was hacking his way in. But meanwhile, I got on his account. I had access to his whole computer. It was like we were on the same Apple network together. So I went and put on some of these phony files that when you try to quit, it says erase the hard disk. And the only answer is yes. And I put his account into child mode and saw that he was doing things like trying to contact some 14-year-old girl in Santa Barbara to have sex. And we kind of messed up with his life a little bit there and eventually got his account disconnected. Those were my 3 times I ever got someone else's password. Although, if I saw some code and I thought, I wonder if there's a flaw in here, I would want to play with it and discover it and try to see what it could lead to. Nowadays, there's just millions and millions of hacking events have occurred by different methods. There's nothing that's absolutely guaranteed safe.
So, Waz, you brought up John Draper a couple of times, Captain Crunch. For anybody who doesn't know who John is, and there's a lot of people who are going to be listening to this and just fascinated and want to know the history, tell us about John.
John was in the Esquire article. He was known as Captain Crunch because the Captain Crunch whistle played that special tone, 2,600 hertz, that would seize a phone line and whatnot. So Captain Crunch was one of the guys. And then Steve Jobs and we wanted to meet him. Steve heard that he had done a radio station interview on KTAO in Los Gatos, where I live now. And we called the station, but we never got to him. And then I was sitting in my dorm one day. I'm spreading lore around and I've got my wall covered with printouts of articles about phone phreaking that year. And a friend came by and I'm telling him that stuff about blue boxing and Captain Crunch. He says, Oh, by the way, I know who Captain Crunch is. That's what he said to me. The FBI hadn't caught Crunch yet. And this is my friend Dave Hurd. And he said, John Draper used to work at KKUP, and so did my friend. That's how I knew him in Cupertino. Steve and I, next time we were back home in our houses, not in the dorm, Steve picked up the phone and called KKUP. And he said, is John Draper there? And they said he dropped out of sight right after the Esquire article. We had the real guy. So we gave our phone number, and within 10 minutes, Crunch called us. He made an appointment to come to the dorm, walk into the dorm where I'd made him such a hero. And he was going to come to our room, and share a whole bunch of phone freaking stories and everything. So we actually met the real Captain Crunch, not quite living up to the article that he was a real woman's man and suave and all this. He kind of was missing teeth and didn't look like he'd showered in ages. And I wanted to see his van full of all this phone equipment, that directs calls all over the world, networking equipment. I opened up his van. It was empty, except there's a radio antenna inside, and he got a blue box out of there. He had one blue box where you could push some buttons, beep, 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 and would automatically dial numbers, which encouraged me to make my box. I had a button that would dial one number on mine, and TTT called a number in Los Angeles called Happy Ben. Old guy singing, Happy Ben is here again. Good to see you. Happy, bye. It's Happy Ben here. And I just loved that. It made me laugh every time I heard it. So I would be able to dial that call on my blue box from a payphone. Anyway, we had a lot of experiences with Crunch, and he told us a lot of things going on in the phreaking world and stories about how you had seized lines by putting little taps and clicks in at the right time. He could go to a payphone in some of the cities in San Jose, and after a certain hour, instead of dialing 411 customer assistance or whatever, 611 customer assistance or 411, which was information, instead of dialing that, it would dial a number over in San Jose that would then make the call to information if it was a 555 number or whatever. It wouldn't dial itself. And while it was dialing, he would add extra taps on the hook switch of the payphone, and he could call numbers and did it in front of us to New York and places. He one time down at Call Computer made a phone call right into the FBI. And we listened as the FBI were talking about an in progress case and going out to pick up a certain person. And this was when the newspapers, the police were denying there was any way to do that sort of thing. There was. I found him as an interesting person. Steve Jobs was a little scared he was going to get us in trouble and avoided him. But I loved meeting up with him every now and then to hear the latest of all this imaginary fanfare you never would think would exist in the technical world.
Now, how much fun were your freaking days was? And I'd be curious, the same for Steve Jobs compared to the immense success the two of you had when you started up Apple and that company took off.
Well, I'd had a life of actually building, designing things right and left, and they were all fun. And the phreaking was sort of the highest level at the time. And it was really 1 year. It was 1 year of college. And by then, I'd done everything you can do in it. Remember, I'm just trying to explore and see what you can do. I'm not trying to make free calls. So I didn't do it anymore. But yeah, that sort of excitement stuck with me forever. I wanted it forever. I wanted to turn digital devices into something exciting that you could show other people at the very least or do useful things with. And when we're making many of those blue boxes, I had a design and I would solder the parts in myself. But then Steve Jobs went and did something on his own. He laid out a little PC board for it. So you wouldn't have to connect all the wires. I mean, he wasn't really a wiring person as much as that. And he made the PC board. Well, if you look at our Apple history, we started out with an idea and a design. And Steve took the step that what we'll do, the way we'll start a company, we'll make a PC board for $20 and sell it for 40. And that was to be the whole start of Apple. But it was really the excitement of having done this thing to ourselves, to know that we had something valuable to others and finding ways to sell it. I think that was an important point in Steve's life because he wanted to find a way to be important in the world, but he didn't have any academic or business background. And how do you do it? You got to have a company someday. So kind of like my computer designs were that. It was the same as the blue box. It kind of gave him a way to put some sales expertise into use and talk to other people and things and make money. He had zero money. I had a job as an engineer. That was a big difference between us.
And do you think he'd still enjoy reminiscing about that? Did he before he passed away? Was that an important time for him? And did he have fond memories?
It's interesting that you asked that because as he got near his death, I had a few phone calls in the last couple of years of his life and even one right before his death. And he absolutely wanted to reminisce about those times. And did you think they'd ever take us here? And he remembered the fun we had. There was a Steve Jobs zero before any Steve Jobs you read about. And that was the Steve Jobs I knew for 5 years before Apple. The fun things we did, the pranks, the blue boxes, concerts, normal young kids, fun things. And he did reminisce to it. And even the blue box, every bit of that blue box story, that was like the first time he found that you can make money if you have a good product. And I'm very glad for him. And he's a wonderful person, did a lot for me in my life.
Well, Woz, listening to you, I'm just so thankful to have you on. You cleared some things up for us. Just a great accounting of your phreaking days. Before we let you go, anything I didn't touch on that you think people would want to know about?
Almost every time you hear about hackers, they're usually just like I was, some person who discovered something, a way to do something, and really just wants to get it cleaned up rather than take advantage of it and sell it to political parties or companies or things like that. Those are the bad ones. But most hackers are really white hat hackers and want to be good and want to expose the black hat ones.
Well, Woz, thank you so much for coming on with us today. I hope you'll keep in touch.
Well, thanks for having me.
Woz is a tough act to follow, but we do want to share a short clip of his partner Steve Jobs from a 1994 interview with the Silicon Valley Historical Association. Jobs talks about creating the blue boxes with Woz and how they started Apple Computer. Let's listen.
I actually figured out how to build one. We built the best one in the world. It was the first digital blue box in the world. But it was the magic of the fact that two teenagers could build this box for $100 worth of parts and control hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure in the entire telephone network in the whole world, from Los Altos and Cupertino, California. And that, if we hadn't have made blue boxes, there would have been no Apple.
I'm Steve Morgan, founder of Cybersecurity Ventures and editor-in-chief at Cybercrime magazine. Joining us today was Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple. You can keep up with all of our media at cybercrimemagazine.com.